going to talk about practical Teams devices rollout. I have an agenda. I have some things I want to share in slide format, and then I'll be done with slides and I'll share my screen. We'll get into some admin consoles and try to make it real. For those of you that I have not met before, hi, I'm Daryl. You can call me DW. My middle name is Wayne. I am Daryl Wayne Hunter, and all of my friends, for as long as I can remember, have called me DW, so feel free to do the same thing. One of my kids even made a little wooden thing up here that says DW in case you see it. I live in Louisville, Kentucky. Louisville, Kentucky is right basically in the center of the U.S., about 6 hours south of Chicago, for those of you that aren't from around here. I have been married to Jenny for about 20-something years, 24 this summer, believe it or not. We have 4 kids. They're beautiful and awesome. 2 of them are adults. 2 of them are still in school. We also have a very dumb dog that is a lot of fun. She keeps us warm and definitely keeps us hopping. One of the things I always like to share people a little bit about myself. So I live in Kentucky, for those of you that know, and those of you who don't know. Kentucky is known for horse racing. Churchill Downs, our horse is here in my town. We're also known for bourbon whiskey, and I love both the horsies and also bourbon whiskey. So it's a thing that you can probably hear me talking about from time to time. In my personal life, if you're up for a challenge, I'm a competitive chess player and a competitive backgammon player. So if you're ever up for a challenge, please ping me. Maybe we can have some fun playing online or something like that. I've done correspondence chess as well. Back in the day when you used to write letters. Do you remember that? You used to pen and paper and actually write things to other people and put a stamp on it. I used to do that as well. So let's dive in. Here's our agenda. So there is a thing I'm going to share with you that has been written by Teams Engineering. It is a playbook, and I have taken that playbook around Teams devices and tried to break it into some practical next step actions for you to know how to address things. So today, I'm going to talk to you about Teams Academy, where you can find this playbook and many others. And then I'm going to walk you through some of my favorite slides, not all of them, of course, because we don't have time. And then I'm going to get into some of our admin consoles. So we do have a few admin consoles that are important. M365 admin is where you'll handle things like identities and licensing, Intune for enrollment compliance, Intra for conditional access, Teams admin in case you want to look at a couple things to make sure it all worked well. And then we'll ask some questions along the way. So you're going to get the whirlwind 35, maybe 40-minute view of every conversation I have around devices, which is very, very often, believe it or not. So let's dive in. Let's start with Teams Academy. Teams Academy is for IT pros like you and me. So on your screen, you have a link, aka.ms/Teams Academy. You should know it, love it, live it, bookmark it. Please bookmark this. And for those of you that are partners on this call, I know some of you are, your customers should know about this too. So please share Teams Academy far and wide. Teams Academy is a place where Teams Engineering drops in the details of our services. So if you want to know nuts and bolts and ports and protocols and why it does this and how it does that, chances are you'll find some resources on Teams Academy to help. But the crux of the matter for today are these really amazing engineering playbooks. So our engineering group has built some very robust playbooks for virtual events and Teams Premium and Teams Places, virtual desktop, VDI, SIP Gateway. There was a question in chat about SIP. We have a playbook around SIP Gateway that can help guide you towards how to take these interop devices and factory reset them and get them up and running on the Teams SIP Gateway. Sherry calling, and then my favorite topic around Teams devices deployment playbook. The link on your screen is a direct short link to the devices playbook. You can click on that at your leisure. And then I want to walk you through some of my favorite things about this playbook. It's robust and it's a lot. So the purpose of this playbook is to help customers like you, or customers that you might have if you're a partner, understand our position when it comes to devices, like maybe a personal device like a phone or a shared device like maybe a Teams room. In this playbook, you can answer a few questions and it'll guide you towards things like this that you see on your screen. This is an example of if you want to take a Teams Room for Windows device out of the box and get it up and running on the network through all the security stuff and loaded for use, you can now click on this top to bottom approach. The reason, I don't think he's on the call today, but one of our engineering friends, his name's Matt, you've probably met him before. I think he's spoken to this community. He's the primary author of this playbook. as you know, in the Microsoft documentation world, there's a lot of documents, and trying to navigate which is the right one to look at, or the right 5 things to look at, or what are the top 20 things to look at can often be daunting. So building this playbook by giving the top-down approach from account identity, licensing, handle things like passwords, get into Intune enrollment, we've tried to build a cookbook for you for all things Teams devices. The reason I wanted to start here is that many of the questions I get are, hey, Daryl, what about this little nuance nugget of Intune? Hey, Daryl, what's the right license I need to have? Daryl, how do I handle things like password expiration? Good news, those are in the playbook. We tried to address all those practical items that come up from time to time. Maybe many of the questions some of you all came here to ask me directly today. This playbook would be a really great resource for you to review after this call. And I just wanted to show you some of my favorite slides. I'm gonna take a pause just for a second. I'm kind of starting to lose my voice. Bear with me. Awesome, thank you. All right, so the slides I'm showing you, I'm going to go through these quick because, again, you have access to this playbook afterwards. We can address things like Teams Room on Windows, including some really great things like laps for local passwords, things like Intune CSPs to make sure you're handling delegated device admin to that Teams Room on Windows, et cetera, et cetera. We dive into Teams Rooms on Android, Teams panels, which are devices like this that might sit outside the wall in your conference room that show you at a glance red, yellow, green presence status, QR code right about here that you can click with your phone and join meetings. We have a wide variety of devices, and our playbook tries to offer for you a top-to-bottom approach of how to take those out of the box and plug them into your network. Teams phones like common area phone, maybe personal phones. We have a playbook, I think, to address most every type of personal space and shared space that you might come up with. And so I'd love for you to review that playbook afterwards. Beyond the typical, what button do I click and how do I get started and how do I build my identity, we also offer a section on security and network considerations, because I'm sure you're just dying to ask me your favorite security and networking question when we get to Q&A as part of this webinar. Likewise, we try to provide written and visual examples of conditional access and compliance policies. And I'll go over a couple of those here in a few minutes. And again, many of you may want to know, how do you handle care and feeding? So I might take these phones or these rooms out of the boxes, I get them up and running. How do I make sure I keep them evergreen? How do I keep them updated? Well, good news, our playbook tried to address that for you. So the whole purpose of this first section was to point you to Teams Academy. Make sure you bookmark Teams Academy. On Teams Academy, we have these great engineering playbooks, one of which is the devices deployment playbook that has lots of great info. And today I am distilling that down into my favorite things that are just the practical, these things, learn these things, know these things, and you're going to have great success. Good? How about a couple thumbs up? Make sure I know that I'm not like just talking to myself. That'd be very helpful. Hey, look at that. Look at all of you. I love it. Thank you. Cool. Well, let's go straight into M365 admin. Again, I'm going to talk about a few things, and then I'm going to go into sharing my screen and show the admin to you to try to make it a little bit more real. The most important things I want you to know about devices when it comes to M365 admin is that we are an identity context. So for many of you that have come from a traditional telephony environment like maybe Cisco or Avaya, or maybe you're coming from a room solution like Zoom or Cisco, the context of those devices is at the device level, MAC address, serial number, IMEI, depending on the device. In the Microsoft world, we start at the identity first. So you have to have a user. That identity is either a personal user or it's a resource account or a shared identity that's created, most likely through PowerShell or M365 admin. So when it comes to personal devices, those personal devices need to have an end user identity like Daryl Hunter at Microsoft.com. And then that end user identity needs to have the appropriate add-on licenses, for example, Intune, or for example, Intra, if you want to do things like Intune enrollment and management and compliance, and maybe conditional access via Intra. So just having an E3 license or just having a G5 license is good to make sure you have access to your team services. But if you want to start deploying personal devices and follow our best practices for Intune enrollment and potentially intra for conditional access, you also need to have that Intune and intra license. It does not come standard with your end user licensing until you get into some of the higher suites that might include some of the mobility and security. It's slightly different with shared devices. Common area phones, the license is called the shared device license. The shared device license does include intra, and it does include Intune. So if you take that common area phone that might sit in the break room, so you say, hey, there's cake in the break room, or maybe you're a pole sitting in a warehouse, or maybe just a touchdown space for people that might be returning to office. That shared device license does include the things that you need for Intune enrollment, Intune compliance, Intune conditional, or intra conditional access. Again, I put a couple playbook links here. So if you want to click on those links and understand how to create your resource accounts, how to make sure you assign common area phone licenses, you can do that. Each of the links I'm giving you comes straight from the playbook. Do you see the method of my madness? I showed you a playbook. I'm going to point you in that playbook all day today. So when you watch this recording later and you have that playbook in front of you, hopefully you can skip to those points of hearing my little face, watching me in double time, and then you can click on the playbook links and follow along. Teams rooms, likewise. Teams rooms you have in the MTR Pro license. That Teams Room Pro license also includes that Intune service and that intra service for compliance, enrollment, conditional access. I think I'm beating that dead horse. I realize we're not all Americans here, so that phrase may be weird for some of you all, but let's move on. Let's talk about Intune. Intune, very, very specifically, we're going to talk through enrollment and compliance. There are dozens of knobs and twists that you have inside Intune, and I want you to know the most important for these Teams devices. Let's talk about Android first. For a Teams Android device, a Teams Room on Android, a panel I showed you, maybe a plastic phone that looks similar to this one from our friends at Audio Kids. This Android-based device today, if you want to enroll this, you enroll this using Device Administrator today. Android Device Administrator is an older technology, and we are moving away from Device Administrator to something new. I'll talk about that in a second. Compliance needs, Intune compliance, post-enrollment for Android, is targeting the identity. So for end users, you're probably using an intra group that contains departments or named users, however it is that you handle your directory services. For common area phones, shared spaces, shared rooms, you probably have intra groups to make sure you're properly targeting the right compliance policy to the right set of resource accounts. Again, there's a few playbook links in here, and the future state of where we're moving towards when it comes to Intune enrollment and Intune compliance is this thing called AOSP, the Android open source project. I believe a few months ago, my colleague Matt Slomka came on and talked about AOSP at depth. I would encourage you to go back and watch that recording. But a couple of things I'm sharing inside these slides are these top 3 links. There's a full migration guide. That full migration guide gives you the buttons that you need to click at a minimum to have Intune enrollment and management of AOSP. And there's also an FAQ. The good news for this FAQ is that this FAQ will take you to a chart. That chart is updated regularly, including this week by Teams Engineering. As we go GA with AOSP firmware, then this chart on that FAQ link that you have is updated to let you know when to expect this new thing called AOSP for your devices. But for the purposes of this slide, Android enrollment and Android compliance is based on the identity. That's separate and different than Windows. Windows devices compliance is targeting at the device account. That means the device has to have an account name. For our best practices, you're going to join that device to intra directory. And there's links based on our playbook that you see here that will walk you through how to have a naming standard. Our naming standard we recommend is MTR-something. So you would name that Teams Room on Windows, maybe the Surface Hub behind me back here. You would name that device inside Windows as MTR-Daryl Surface Hub, for example. Then when you join intra directory, that device name of MTR-something can then be targeted. Hey, Matt, I'm glad you're here. Then that device can be targeted for things like compliance and enrollment along the way. So the main things here, Android devices, we're going to target at the identity level, the account level. Windows-based devices for compliance, you're going to target at the device account based upon directory services. Follow that playbook. I mentioned it to you before. I'm going to continue to point you towards it while Matt Slomka throws tomatoes at me. I'm looking forward to that. Cool. I already got my first tomato. Sweet. Intune. When we get to the things I want to talk through to kind of supplement through Intune enrollment, this slide, future AOSP link is not accessible. That might be an artifact from these particular slides. I'll make sure that we share that to you. What I'm trying to share with you is a one-page PDF summary. I think it's on an upcoming slide, but I'll make sure that PDF gets shared to you. Thanks for pointing that out. I'm reusing this particular set of deck from an internal thing, so that's probably sending you to an internal link. That's a miss on my part, but I'll clean that up with Jonathan and Don before we send these slides to you. Intune enrollment, this kind of repeats what I just said. You're leveraging the Windows enrollment process, therefore it's around joining Intro directory. And then for Android, today we're using Company Portal. The Company Portal app is that device administrator thing I mentioned, and Company Portal app will mediate all of the things around identity and enrollment and compliance and workplace join and conditional access. In our future state of AOSP, Company Portal goes away, and there are two distinct applications, one called Intune and one called Authenticator, that will handle all of that fancy security stuff for you. And again, all those details are in a previous slide. Click the link. You can read more along the way, or go back and listen to the recording from my friend Matt from a few months ago, because I'm sure he did a much better job than I just did with a gravelly voice. Bruno, you shared that one link is not accessible. It's taking you to this PDF. This is a screenshot of a PDF. I don't believe these links are active, but I will. But those links you see there, the full migration guide and the FAQ, those links have already been shared with you. So the purpose of this one-page PDF is that if I would come in front of you as a customer and you have some questions, I usually start with this one-page PDF and then link from here to have a thoughtful conversation. So if I would share that with every customer anyway, why would I not share that with you today? That's what I'm trying to accomplish with this particular slide. I want to take a pause, drink a little bit of water, and then we'll talk about Intra. Hang on one second for me. Thank you for your patience. Surprisingly, I'm real and I'm a human, and I traveled last week and I got this really interesting cough. So I'm looking forward to being with you. I'm glad I'm here, but I apologize for the voice and probably a few more stops along the way to drink some water. Intra Admin, formerly known as Azure Active Directory Admin. Intra Admin is the place that you would go for handling some of the more security-minded things to make sure that you get access to the right applications at the right time. That's exactly how I feel, Jonathan. You nailed it completely, except for I'm more of like a Shaggy than a Scooby. In Intra Conditional Access, you would follow the playbook, of course. But the things that I want you to understand, and I'm going to say it out loud, and I'll show it to you here in a second with another slide, and then when I drop to my screen sharing. For shared devices, we do not recommend interactive multi-factor authentication. When I specifically say interactive multi-factor authentication, I mean like an app on a phone, right? So I highly recommend multiple factors, something you know, something you have, something you are. And most of your security folks, especially your auditors, are going to want to make sure that you are thinking through the security and have compensating controls in place to make sure your devices are secure and nothing bad happens. I don't want you to hear Microsoft tell you we don't support MFA. What I want you to hear is we recommend, and our playbook gives you great guidance of how you can take one factor, for example, device compliance, another factor, for example, maybe an IP restriction to make sure that you're only logging into devices from your known network locations, and couple those with your security folks to recognize that you are addressing typically their security needs around multiple factors to authenticate to and have access to these devices. And so when it comes to Android and Windows, we have really great security articles. We have really great playbook options to help you think through from words and also from a visual perspective what conditional access policies might be valuable for you. So again, we want you to treat these devices like appliances. We want you to treat these devices like kiosk type devices. You should not be messing around with them. You shouldn't be adding third-party software to it. You shouldn't be trying to reverse engineer it to, air quotes, make it more secure because you know better. All of those things are perfectly valid, and that's great for you to think that way, but you should trust that we've thought through hardware security, software security, account authentication security to make sure these devices will stay active and up to date and ready to go at a moment's notice. And so conditional access, following our best practices around IP location and using Intune compliance as a factor, is your best path forward. And here it is. Our playbook talks about that in a lot more depth. So to round out this section on Intra, I want you to know that we provided, and Matt, who's here, wrote most of these things, I believe. We provided some visual representations of what a typical intra-conditional access rule might look like for Windows devices. We want you to target a set of, a group of those devices. We want you to only be targeting the cloud apps of Exchange, Teams, and SharePoint. There's no reason for these devices to be looking for any other applications. These are purpose-built kiosk devices. You should target that resource account to only be using the Windows platform. There's no reason for a Teams room on Windows device to not use a Teams room on Windows or not use a Windows operating system. There are caveats. A great caveat might be a panel like this, where this panel uses the same user account as a Windows device. That way you can check in and check out of this room device. This happens to run Android. Your room's account runs Windows. Our playbook covers both of those scenarios, but we try to give you a visual representation of what that conditional access policy might look like. Another example might be an Android device. It's very similar, but in this case, we're looking at the Android platform, not the Windows platform. We're still targeting a shared devices group. We're still targeting Exchange, Teams, and SharePoint. And each of these examples that I share with you are, of course, in our playbook. And they're not designed to be anything else other than potentially a way for you to think, how do I make sure I keep my device secure and up and running and up to date? These are the best practices we're providing for you. I'm a visual learner, and I love having charts like this to help me think about applications as compared to just clicking on a link and reading a Learn article. So when our playbook was built, I'm glad that they thought about different learning styles to help kind of hammer home what we're trying to teach when it comes to building properly secured devices. So that's what we have here around Intra. Now let's move into Teams Admin. And in just a moment, I'll drop with the slides and we'll go into screen sharing. And we're about 25 minutes in. I think we're still doing pretty good on time. Excellent. I want to make sure there's time for questions. In Teams Admin, once you log into the device and the device is enrolled, it's gone through any sort of compliance and conditional access policy that you have in place, everything's secure on the up and up, yay, awesome, it will show up in Teams Admin. The things I want you to see in Teams Admin, the practical things, is really just this one slide. I want you to know that when the device is in Teams Admin, you can click on that device and go to Software Health to see if it's fully up to date or if there are updates to install. I wanted to give you two examples. The example on the left is today's current state for most of our devices. I call this Device Administrator. We can also call this Company Portal. I'm going to try this. There is an application right here called Company Portal. This is a visual indicator to you that this is using that current state. We might call it legacy state of Device Administrator firmware using Company Portal to do the device management. The future state that I teased you earlier about is AOSP. Notice there is no Company Portal over here. Company Portal goes away and is replaced by Intune and Authenticator. So the practical thing for Teams Admin for you to look at is, one, see if you're up to date or if you have updates to install, and I'll show you that in more specifics when I share my screen. And also for you to have just a one-stop shop to look at software health to understand the state of your firmware. Are you on the current/legacy Company Portal state? Or perhaps you have some devices that have already gone GA, like maybe an AudioCodes C470 HD phone or Teams Room or some new devices that went GA this week. Maybe you've already moved towards Intune and Authenticator for things like device management. So again, the one slide I wanted to talk to you about in Teams Admin is related to software health. And I can share my screen and we can make it all real. So that takes us here where I'm going to be done with slides. Hooray, you made it. We got through all of these slides in just under 30 minutes. I'm going to stop sharing slides. I'm going to share my screen. I'm going to try to make it a little bit more real for you. But while I do that, Don or Jonathan, is there anything in the chat I haven't seen yet I need to address?
Nothing at this point. There is one question I think we want to have Dale come in at the end because he's asking about your thoughts around, what happens with these devices that get deprecated, right? So he's talking specifically about polytrios and how that's on the roadmap to expire in 2026 and what's going on with that. So maybe that's something we can hold on until the end.
Sounds good. Maybe we can hold on to the end. I'll do my very best to address it the best way that I can.
Okay.
All right, let me share my screen. I'll drag over a browser window. While all that shows up properly, I'll make sure we're still doing good on time, which I think we are. We're doing really good on time. Okay. All right, so if you go back to my agenda and remember where we started at M365 admin. M365 admin is where we handle things like identities, or we handle things like licensing. For many of you all, this is going to be very, very boring, and that's okay. But I just want to kind of like try to connect the dots to everything I talked about. So for named users, like for example, Adele Vance. Adele Vance has a E5 license. This E5 license does not include things like Intune or Intra. So what that means is Adele has great ability to access Teams, but Adele will not have the ability to Intune enroll, have an Intune compliance policy targeted towards her, or have an Intra conditional access policy targeted towards her, because none of those licenses have been assigned to her. So if I want to ensure for my named users and also my shared devices, if I want to ensure I can do all these great things I just told you about, I want to make sure I'm practically assigning these Intune licenses so these accounts can be authenticated and logged in along the way. And you do that through M365 Admin Center. So you would click on a license and you would add an appropriate license that includes things like Intra and includes things like Intune to make that happen. In this particular account example, my end users are running a Microsoft 365 E5. The good news about Microsoft 365 E5 is that it does include the things that I care about related to Intune and Intra. Likewise, I mentioned shared devices. I'm going to click on, I'll pick one. How about Cisco NTRA? This particular device runs the Teams Room Pro license. The Teams Room Pro license does include Intune, and it does include Intra P1, just like I said it did. Similar, if I wanted to bring up like a common area phone that might be running the shared device license, I'll pick this one that just happens to be called Beta Phone for whatever reason. This is running the shared device license. Again, I want to make sure that you know the shared device license includes Intune and includes Intra P1. So at the M365 admin console, you can address and create the identities, whether it's a user identity from active users or whether it's going to be a shared identity like a room that you would create from resources rooms. Once you create the identity, you can go into active users, assign the appropriate license, alongside the license, activate the service like Intune or Intra. So you can do all the great things that we've talked about. Again, I'm trying to keep this very, very practical. I'm not trying to make it overcomplicated because it really is just as simple as I just said it was. Let's dive into Intune. Thanks for your patience. All right, inside Intune, at a glance, I can look at all of my devices that are part of this particular environment. The things I want you to know is that we've had to handle things like enrollment. So let's just start with enrollment. I'm in Intune, I'm under devices, I want to click the enrollment button. Today, our playbook describes enrollment as an Android device administrator thing. So you have to click on Android device administrator and turn on the option to enroll devices with Android device administrator. That means also any compliance policy that is built and I want to have targeted towards these devices. Hello, you're going to wake up or you're going to spin at me? Might spin at me. Hey, there we go. Any compliance policies that I want to apply and target towards these devices need to be an Android device, an Android compliance policy focused on the platform of Android device administrator. So I'll just pick on this common area phone again. I've created a compliance policy. It is a device administrator platform compliance policy, and I'm using appropriate controls and targeting an intra group that contains the resource accounts for my common area phones. It's all that's covered in the playbook. It is just as simple as I said it was. But hey, Daryl, didn't I hear you say that you're moving away from device administrator and you're moving towards AOSP? Yes, you did. Thank you for asking the question. So the same situation when you go to devices, enrollment, Android, you will have to create a new enrollment profile for AOSP, corporate-owned user-associated devices. And I think Matt described that in depth last time he was on this particular series. The links I shared with you before will send you to the administrative FAQs and send you to the admin guides on how to do this. But the AOSP enrollment policy will look like this. The big key thing is you need to make sure you enable for Microsoft Teams devices. If you don't do that, then your Teams devices, when they have an AOSP firmware, will not use this policy for things like enrollment. So you have a job to do, and you need to prepare your environment for it. So even if today you're not ready for AOSP, even if today the devices you're using are not yet generally available with an AOSP firmware, what you can do is follow the guidance we gave you last spring, I think it was, that I gave you the links for today. And you can create your enrollment profile today for AOSP. Likewise, you can create your compliance policies for AOSP. That way they're sitting there and ready to go. So when the day comes that you're ready to install that AOSP firmware, you have all the enrollment things taking place, you have all the compliance policies in place, and that device just takes a simple firmware, reboots, and moves on with life. If you do not prepare your environment, if you do not plan ahead with an enrollment profile and enrollment policy and compliance policies, then your devices will log out when you upgrade them from device administrator or company portal firmware to AOSP. So it's very, very important that you understand that we're making changes. I've provided guidance for you on what you need to create. And I know I'd be happy to help you. And I know that Don and John gave you a link at the beginning where they can connect with you. Talk to your account team, make sure that you're ready, make sure you understand what needs to be done for you to have greatest success for this change for device management that will take place over the next few months at Microsoft. That is Intune enrollment and compliance. Next thing I want to talk about very briefly is conditional access. When I was showing you my slides, I mentioned that, and I showed you some visual examples of conditional access policies that would target certain applications and also maybe target IP locations, maybe using compliance. That's exactly what I'm doing as well, although all cards on the table, I have name locations turned off right now, just because of some personal stuff I have going on. I'm not always working at this desk. So from time to time, I've had to turn that off. And I'll show you where that is so you can see what that looks like. Under devices conditional access, you're going to create those targeted conditional access policies. And I'll just go back to common area phones just because it's just simple. In common area phones, I am targeting specifically that intra group that contains the resource accounts of my common area phones. I am targeting those three resources I mentioned to you and showed you visually earlier, Teams, Exchange, and SharePoint. I have some conditions that are important to me. I want to make sure I'm only using Android as a device platform. Again, I'm trying to work with my auditors, maybe work with my security team to control these devices and keep them as secure as I can. So device platform are a great example of something you can do. I mentioned to you network locations. Again, I have this turned off currently, but if I wanted to turn this on, then what I could do is I could also now make sure if you're coming from my house in Crestwood, Kentucky, or maybe my dad's house in Elkville, Illinois, or some other set of known locations, I can ensure that you can only log in and only have a conditional access policy that lets you in if this network location matches a known network location. So for you, that may be your company well-known egress locations for your network. Maybe it's a certain branch. Maybe you want to make sure you have policies for bank branches only come from bank branch locations, not corporate offices, and vice versa. I know I'm working with a very large service organization right now that has multiple policies to make sure corporate things are only coming from the corporate network and branch things are only coming from branch networks. And we provide that flexibility with conditional access. Likewise, excuse me, this is where I mentioned that when you check this box that says require multi-factor authentication, that's what enables this interactive MFA app on your phone. That's not what you should be doing for shared devices, and our playbook covers that very, very well. Instead, we recommend different factors. For example, require device to be marked as compliant. That's a great example of using maybe a network location and a factor of compliance to make sure you're meeting multiple factors for your network and security folks. And conditional access gives you lots of knobs and twists. Our playbook covers the ones that are and are not supported for Teams devices, and that would get you off to the races, or at least really, really well started. Now I'm going to end my screen sharing session just kind of back in Teams Admin Center. I mentioned to you before that in Teams Admin Center, once devices are logged in and all the enrollment takes place and compliance takes place, and it's up and running, you should be able to see it here, assuming it comes up. Come on, you can do it. I know you can. Excellent. I want to use my neat frame as an example. This device, at a glance, I showed you it's up to date, and you see here this thing called Company Portal app. When I was sharing my slides, I was describing to you the Company Portal device administrator. That's our current or legacy model. Whereas our future point, I'll give you an example, might be a phone like an audio code C470 HD. This device is not running Company Portal. There is no Company Portal app. Instead, it's running Authenticator and Intune. So at a glance, you can see I am now running this new thing called AOSP. I do have an update available. That's good. So I can click this button and install that update if I want manually. Or what we do offer in Teams is we do offer some automatic update rings. We have a thing called validation that might be valuable for those devices you want to always get the latest and greatest update. If you want to defer for things like 15 days for apps and 30 days for firmware, we have another ring called General. And then our final ring is one that's more of a even further deferred. I keep most of my devices personally in final, just because of the nature of what I do for demos and teaching at Microsoft. But we provide choices for you to keep your devices automatically up to date. But of course, you can manually update it if you would like to. I did skip one thing. I'm going to go back real quick. I showed you in Teams Admin Center at a glance where you can see Company Portal or not. If it's not Company Portal, then you know it's Authenticator and Intune. You can see the same thing inside your Intune portal. So under devices, if I would filter by Android, assuming that my kids are not upstairs playing their video games and taking all my bandwidth, which I'm sure they are. There's a snow day. Welcome to snow days in Kentucky. All right, here's all of my Android devices. If I choose to sort them by operating system, I can see at a glance the ones that still run device administrator. That's not very many for me because I've been doing a lot of our internal testing for this new thing called AOSP, corporate owned user associated. So Teams Admin Center, you can see at a glance. Intune Admin Center, you can see at a glance if you're running that device administrator or if you're running AOSP. So the things I wanted to share with you today is the practical side of playbooks. We have a lot of details, but those details sometimes might get muddy. So I wanted you to see the main things from my perspective around M365, identity, licensing, Intune enrollment and compliance, intra-conditional access, some very real world, very practical examples of what that might look like for you. I don't have anything more to present. I can answer questions that we have, or we can talk about whatever you want, or whatever Don and John would like for us to talk about. So Don and John, where do you want to go from here? Start with some questions.
We do actually have some good questions, by the way.
Okay.
So we are going to, as you know, ASOP is a very big part of a lot of organizations. So a couple of these questions are back to that thing. So Jesse was wanting a little bit more detail as far as how does the process from transitioning from ADM to AOSP actually work? Can you talk just briefly about that, just so to make sure everybody understands what's going to happen when it comes out, that firmware comes out from that OEM?
Yeah, I'll do my best. You can think of the firmware itself as what's the most important here. So the firmware, I'll go back to Teams real quick. So this device, I'll go back to my meet frame. The firmware running on this device has a firmware name, NFF something or another, whatever that means, I don't know, and it doesn't really matter. And in that firmware, if you think of your firmware as your hand, you've got different fingers. Some of those fingers are related to the Teams app. There's a Teams admin agent that talks from the device to M365 Admin Center. Company portal is like the heart of the matter for all things enrollment and compliance. And then there's an OEM agent that's kind of some secret sauce. And then there's a Teams app. All those things smushed together as a piece of firmware. When AOSP firmware is available, it will show up down here as there's an update to install. I'll show you an adjacent update just for the nature. Actually, I think I just installed it this morning. I should have not installed that. That way I could show you what it looks like in real life. I messed it up, but that's okay. When a firmware comes up and it says you have an update to install, on the right-hand side, you will install the update. And physically what happens is that you download a new piece of firmware that has different fingers on it. That new piece of firmware is now on my device that I'm showing on my screen. I now have a firmware here, but I've not installed that firmware yet because I've not rebooted my phone. You can think of this kind of like a dual boot scenario. I am pulling that firmware into memory while I'm still running the old. When I reboot the device, hi, thank you, Adele, for calling me. When I reboot the device, then that device will no longer have the company portal application. It will no longer be able to speak company portal. It will only now speak this new thing called AOSP using the new applications called, let me get back to that example, Authenticator and Intune. So the best analogy I have for this is multi-language. The device administrator or company portal only speaks English, for example, and AOSP is only speaking German, for example. I do not speak both English and German. I speak English. And then when I reboot that device, now I only speak German. So a great way, I think Matt even mentioned this once before, is that all of the things that are company portal related that talk to Intune and talk to the M365 cloud, once you take this new AOSP firmware, that doesn't even exist anymore. Those applications aren't installed on the device, so they only have the ability to use these new applications called Authenticator and Intune. From an end user perspective, they see nothing. If you've done your work and you've created your enrollment profile, if you've created your compliance policies as needed, the device reboots. Chances are you're doing these device upgrades and reboots after hours anyway, so the end user would never even see the device reboot. So if you've done your job, the device stays logged in, and there's nothing about the end user that even notices that anything happened along the way. Is that helpful?
I hope so. I know Chris was asking about that reboot, though. Is the post-installation reboot part of the install? Would the OEM schedule nightly reboots to do the job? I mean, you can, right? You have that as an option, but no manual reboot needed, right? Is what he's asking.
Yeah, so no. So the OEM scheduled reboot just reboots the device. That doesn't install applications. So you actually have to physically install this piece of firmware. So when we go GA, it's going to be a manual update only. You're not enforcing these automatic update rings for this AOSP thing for a period of time. That way you have time to test and validate. So you will make a decision. You will click a button and you will upgrade the firmware from company portal to AOSP. And it's very, very clear. If you saw those screenshots from the slides that you're going to get, it will tell you if it's company portal or it will tell you if it's AOSP.
Yeah. Yeah, I think he understands that. Perfect. Okay.
You got it.
The other one so Martin was asking, so let's pretend we get all these updated to AOSP. Can I disable Android DA then at that point?
That's a great question. I get this question a lot, and I don't have a really awesome answer for you. The day will come eventually when old dusty boxes that live on warehouse shelves that may contain firmware running device administrator will all be refreshed. However, I don't know when that will occur, and neither will you. So the day will come that an old device will appear in your network and you'll have to be able to handle it.
Yeah.
So either you're going to have to keep device administrator up and running and walk through this process of which you enroll it as it is, update it through Teams Admin Center, et cetera, upgrade it to AOSP, or you'll have to work with your OEM like Audio Codes or HP Poly or Daylink or whoever to use their management software to keep the firmware up to date and then log in the device and do the thing you needed to do. Yep. Will the day come that we can get rid of Android Device Administrator? Absolutely, for sure. But I'm just cautioning you, and I'm very, very conservative. So I'm cautioning you that if you upgrade all your devices and now you're done and you turn off DA, what if you replace a device? What if you need to buy 100 more? What if those come from distribution and they are just old dusty boxes that have sat in a warehouse for a while? You have to have a way.
Yeah, and I think that's a big, huge point. So make sure that you're not turning it off, because until you get rid of all those old boxes, and everybody has them, forget it. You're going to need it to get those on first, just because of that upgrade needs to happen. So good question, though. Thank you, Martin.
Great question.
Eric has a more detailed question. Maybe we can save that for a little bit later. He's actually looking at what is the correct exclusion criteria to ensure the devices are excluded from this policy? And he's talking about MTR devices with the conditional access policy. I don't know if you want to take a look at that later on and respond to Eric, or we can take that offline.
It's a great question. I've not looked at the people, but chances are if he's asking about exclusion criteria, he's probably thinking through, like, how do you use device filters for things like make and model? That's probably what he's thinking through.
Exactly. That's what it is. Yep.
What I would normally do is I would send you to my good friend Tracy Herr, who is brilliant and smart, and you may know who she is already, whoever asked that question. But Tracy's written an incredible blog article describing when and how to use device filters. She's describing this as the chicken and egg concept of how do you pull the filters if you can't pull the filters. She's done a much better job of it than I can. So if somebody can grab that link and drop it in chat now, great. If not, then I can go look for it really quick.
Yeah, I'm looking for that right now to see.
I know her blog is UCMess, so UCMess. I can't remember the blog's on WordPress. I can't remember.
WordPress.com.
Yeah.
Drop it in.
Yeah, thank you. But she's written a really great article, and I think she also got a post. I always go to Tracy's blog because that's just where I usually start. But I think she's taken this exact thing and gotten it published on learn.microsoft.com or maybe even our own Microsoft tech community. I can't recall, but Tracy's the smart one that you're looking for there.
I think Josh found it. So thank you, Josh, for finding that pretty quickly.
Thanks, Josh.
Appreciate that.
Doug had a nice question, I thought.
Well, yeah, Doug has a question around conditional access policy. So he talking back when you were talking about conditional access policies and showing how you can leverage the network connection. How is that network connection determined? First question.
Yeah, NAT.
That's what he was saying. Yep, it's that. And is there any chance to see inside that IP address as needed, if needed?
I'm not about where anyway the internal address can be used for like filtering for conditional access. So I believe that when you look at your login, your actual signed in logs, then you follow and understand what conditional access policy is matching or not. The network location shows that public IP address because of how NAT works. But I believe that deeper inside the packet, we can see what your private IP address is that you're coming from. We're just not able to do anything with that information.
Yep.
If there's somebody else in this call that knows a better answer to that, please chime in either verbally or maybe drop it in the chat. But this is NAT, this is public IP addresses. That's what we're using here is public IPs.
And then there's another one, and I think I know this one, but Lana was asking about, so when do you really need to build out a new Intune conditional access policy for AOSP? And the answer to that is yes, you do,
Trick
for the
question.
most part. It
Trick
is.
question.
There's parts to it.
You need to create a new Intune enrollment and a new Intune compliance policy.
Yep.
You most likely will not need to create a new intra conditional access policy. So the Intune work is what matters here, right? So even though I access conditional access from the Intune portal, you can access that from intra. Technically, that's an intra application, not an Intune application. So conditional access very specifically is intra, not Intune. And there's nothing about AOSP that's specific to your conditional access policy. So as long as if you're using compliance as a factor for conditional access, that compliance can be DA or EA or AOSP or whatever else. So it's kind of a trick question. Do you need to do something in Intune? Yes. Do you need to do conditional access in intra? No.
All right, then Mary has a good question. For the pause on the auto updates related to AOSP migration, is that only pause for the firmware updates, or is that all updates when it comes like the Teams agents version, all that piece? I think she was talking about when you were going to the drop down and going into those different rings, right, for updates. Does that apply to everything, or is it specific things that are going to get paused, so to speak, in those?
Yeah, great question.
On the rings.
Those update rings very specifically are firmware or Teams app. The pause I mentioned is that we have made a choice, very specifically, we've made a choice that when we go GA for firmware that is AOSP related, we are not going to enforce that through automatic updates for a period of time. That is only the firmware update for AOSP, whereas we're requiring you to make a manual decision for a period of time. All other automatic updates apply.
And then Randy did have one about, okay, so from Randy's understanding, Intune is required for devices that are for user accounts, right? So that Intune license. We use Poly devices only, and we are told to manage these devices, we should use Poly Lens versus Intune. I mean, I think, go ahead. Why don't you talk about that a little bit, because I think they have different applications there.
Yeah, it's kind of it's an interesting conversation. Randy, I think, is who you said wrote this one.
Randy. Yep.
Yeah. So Poly Lens is the OEM product that Poly can provide for you to do things like out-of-the-box provisioning of those devices. Mm-hmm. But Poly Lens will not log you in that device. It's not for the identity and login and usability. It's at the device level and only device level. We do not support Poly Lens and how they may potentially push a beta or non-GA version of firmware or software via their support tool. So our stance is Poly Lens is a great product. I would love for you to use Poly Lens to get these devices ready to go out of the box. Once you log in these devices, you should be using Teams Admin Center for the ongoing care and feeding of these devices. And you should be using Intune as a device management platform. You may not want to use Intune, and that's your choice. Customers have the choice to use Intune or not. If you do not use Intune, which means you do not install an Intune license for an end user, or you do not enable the service for the Intune license for like a shared device license or a Teams Room Pro, then you won't have access to compliance or enrollment. So you won't be able to use compliance as a factor in conditional access. So Intune very specifically comes as a licensed product. We use Intune for enrollment and compliance, and you can use it. We recommend you use it for our best practices, but it's not the same thing as Poly Lens. It's not more or less than Poly Lens. Poly Lens is at the hardware level, and then you still have to address identity and licensing and login.
Yeah, and then Jay kind of pipes in there, but not for SIP devices like BBX models for Poly.
Yeah,
right.
SIP,
so you would
SIP
probably
is a whole different beast. Yeah, SIP is a whole different
completely
beast.
different beast at this point. Yeah, I would agree. So let's go back to thank you for that answer. Dale's question, right? So Dale's question was wrapped around end of, basically end of life for Android 12, right? And it looks like somebody responded to that and said that there was actually a post on Microsoft Learn about end of life for that, talking about, hey, we can't keep it on forever. This is what's going to happen with Android 12. I think we find that anytime there's an Android OS being deprecated, right? So I don't know if there's anything else you want to talk about that.
Yeah,
pretty much. That's what it is.
At the end of the day, it's up to our OEMs to keep their devices up to date. Right? We provide a spec, and the spec that we provide says we want to run this Teams application and these other applications, and you need to provide an operating system. From a phone perspective, all of our phones have moved from Android 9 to Android 12 or 13 at this point in time.
Yep.
There are still some rooms and I think some panels that might still be running some flavors of 10 and 11 and 12. I think most of those are currently actively being updated as we speak.
Exactly.
The certification end date, whenever the certification end date happens, then we will still provide support. I think it's plus 2 years after certification end date. So there's things that we are obligated to continue to update and support, but the OEM needs to speak into what their lifespan looks like, because every OEM treats it differently. We've had an OEM, I think, exit the system as well.
Yep.
Kind of like we've also had some OEMs. I used to work for Audio Codes, for example. And so there's some devices that were active OEM devices from Audio Codes that are no longer certified just because they've reached their end of life. And so that's the website that I think was probably shared describes our life cycle.
Perfect.
My favorite bourbon is Blanton's. I'm a Buffalo Trace guy. So right here behind me, you see Buffalo Trace, and you can see several back here. So I talk
That's
about
awesome.
That.
Yeah, we can talk about that kind of stuff anytime, right?
That's right.
All right. I do think, we are actually at overtime. So I know there was a couple other questions out there. Let's see if we can get that information and we'll respond back to that. But we do need to continue on. So thank you, Daryl. Let me get back on here. JW, if you want to turn your camera back on.
Yeah, here I am.
There we are. Oh,
yeah, that was great. Really great stuff.
Thank you. Thank you. Appreciate it.
And questions that haven't been answered, we'll answer them. I mean, it was a great one from Randy talking about firmware rollbacks, things like that, so we can answer them.
Yeah,
Keep the chat going. Yeah. So thank you everybody for great questions and a great presentation.
As always. Thank you, Daryl.
You are welcome. Glad to be here.
Yeah. As we wrap up.